I want to tell you about the night I found out I had never been alone in my own home. Not once. Not for a single night during the 2 years I lived there. I was 18 when I moved into that apartment. It was the first place I had ever had on my own. A second-floor unit in an old converted building in the Midwest, the kind of building that had been carved up over the decades into smaller and smaller units until the hallways were narrow and the walls between apartments were thin enough to hear your neighbors breathe. I moved in with my boyfriend at the time, and from the beginning, the building felt off. Not dramatically off. Not the kind of off that makes you immediately pack your things and leave. Just a low, persistent strangeness. A quality to the air at night. A sense that the space around you was larger than the floor plan suggested. I told myself it was an old building. Old buildings settle. Old buildings have their own sounds and their own rhythms and their own history, and you learn to live with those things when the rent is right. The first incident was the porch. A man would stand on it. Not every night, but often enough that I noticed the pattern. I would glance through the window, and there would be a figure out there, not moving, just standing, and by the time I got to the door to look properly, he would be gone. I called the police 3 times in the first 6 months. 3 times they came, walked the perimeter, found nothing, wrote it off. One officer told me that old buildings cast all kinds of strange shadows at night, that exterior lights and window reflections did unusual things to the dark. I wanted to believe him. The backyard was the same. Our unit had a back window that looked out over a narrow strip of dead grass between the building and the alley fence, and sometimes, late, when everything was quiet, I would catch movement out there. Someone walking along the fence line, someone standing near the dumpster, not doing anything, just standing. My boyfriend and I would look at each other and I would feel that cold drop in my stomach and we would go to bed and not talk about it. Because what do you say? We think someone is watching us, but the police can find nothing, and we cannot afford to move, and maybe we are both just anxious. Maybe we are both making something out of shadows and coincidence. That is what you tell yourself when you live somewhere you cannot leave. The dogs were the first sign I could not explain away. We had 2 of them, big, calm animals not prone to nervousness. In that apartment, they were never calm. At night, they would plant themselves at the bedroom door and stare at the ceiling. Not growl, not bark, just stare, ears flat, the kind of stillness that is not relaxed but frozen. I would follow their gaze. The ceiling above our bedroom was the ceiling of the attic. The attic that we were told was shared storage, sealed off on our side, with access only from the building manager's unit at the far end of the hall. The dogs would stare at that ceiling for hours. We moved after 2 years, not because of any specific incident, but because the lease ended and we both quietly wanted out of that building without ever saying it directly to each other. We went up into the attic before we left to retrieve our Christmas decorations. That was the only reason we went up there. We were not looking for anything. We were not investigating. We were getting boxes of ornaments in December, and that is all. I went up first through the access hatch in the hallway. The attic was low-ceilinged and dim, and it smelled of old insulation and dust and something else underneath that I could not immediately identify. I moved toward the far end where our storage boxes were, and I found it. I did not understand what I was seeing at first. My brain refused to assemble the pieces into a coherent image. There was a section of the brick firewall, the partition that separated our attic space from the empty apartment unit next door, that had been broken apart. Not crumbled, not collapsed from age. Broken deliberately, with the bricks removed and stacked neatly to one side, leaving a gap wide enough for a person to step through. On the other side of that gap, in the empty unit's attic space, there was a space. A lived-in space. A folded blanket. A pillow. A small battery-powered light. Food wrappers arranged with a kind of deliberate neatness. A water bottle. A change of clothes in a plastic bag. I stood there looking at it for a long time. The cold was very clear in that moment. The smell I had not been able to place was the smell of a person. Body heat and breath, absorbed into insulation over a long period of time. Someone had been up here. For how long, I did not know yet. But they had been comfortable. They had set up the space with the patience of someone who planned to stay. I called my boyfriend up. He stood beside me and looked at it. Neither of us spoke for what felt like a full minute. Then he said very quietly, "They could hear everything." And that was the thing that undid me. Not the presence of the space, not even the deliberateness of it, the broken wall, the careful arrangement of objects. What undid me was the acoustic truth of what he said. That attic sat directly above our bedroom, the one room in the apartment where we were most unguarded, most vulnerable, most ourselves. For 2 years, the ceiling above our bed had been inches of old wood and insulation between us and someone lying on a blanket in the dark, listening. We called the police. They came and documented everything. They told us the access to the empty unit's attic was from a ground floor window at the back of the building, the window that faced the narrow strip of dead grass that I had watched all those nights. The strip of yard where I had seen a figure standing near the dumpster. Not going to the dumpster, not coming from the alley, standing, the way someone stands when they are waiting to go somewhere without being seen. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake listening to the sounds from above. I had heard them for 2 years, and I had told myself it was the building settling, timber contracting in the cold, pipes expanding and dropping back. I had given those sounds every innocent explanation I could construct, because the true explanation was too large to hold. I do not know how long he had been coming up there. I do not know if he was ever in the apartment itself when we were out. The police said there was no evidence of entry into the living space, but they also told me that if someone had been careful enough and patient enough to maintain that attic access for that length of time without us ever catching them, careful was likely a deep habit. I still sometimes hear sounds above me when I lie in the dark. Normal sounds. Any building makes sounds at night. I know this. I know the rational explanation. But there is a version of me that was left in that bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening. And that version of me never really came back down. She is still up there, still listening back. I have worked in healthcare for a long time. I have worked nights in an ICU, in long-term care, in units where the line between living and not living is something you learn to feel in the air of a room before any monitor tells you. You develop a sense for it. You develop a knowledge of what a person looks like in the last hours of their life that no training prepares you for. It is something you absorb slowly over years until one day you realize you have known for a while before the family has, before the attending has, before the numbers change. This is a job that teaches you things about the nature of existence that you did not go looking for. And one night it taught me something I have never been able to completely put down. It was a night shift in a long-term care facility in the Mid-South. The wing I was covering was a quiet one, 8 rooms, most of them occupied by patients who had been with us for months, whose families visited on regular schedules, whose preferences I knew. There was one patient, an elderly woman in her late 80s, who had been in the ICU section of our wing for about 3 days. She was at the end. We all knew it. Her family had been notified. Her paperwork was in order. She had been comfortable, or as comfortable as we could make her, and she had been quiet. I had checked on her at 11, and she had been asleep. At 2:59 in the morning, her call bell rang. I noted the time because our documentation requires it, and the time stayed with me. 2:59. I went to her room. When I pushed open the door, she was sitting up in bed. Not partially, completely upright, which at her level of decline was difficult and should have been something she could not manage on her own. Her hands were flat on either side of her on the mattress. Her eyes were open. She was looking at the bathroom door. I said her name. I asked if she was in pain. She turned and looked at me, and her expression was not the confused expression of someone waking from a deep sleep. It was completely lucid. More lucid, I would say, than she had been in weeks. She said, "Can you make him leave?" I looked at the bathroom door. It was slightly ajar, the way we leave it to allow light access for patient safety at night. The strip of light from inside fell across the floor at the foot of her bed. There was nothing there. I told her I would check. I pushed the door fully open. The bathroom was empty. I turned the overhead light on. Every corner was clear. I went back to her bedside and I took her hand and I asked her if she meant someone in the room right now. She said, "He has been standing in the corner since I was admitted." She said this calmly. The way you describe a piece of furniture, the way you describe something that has simply been there for a long time. I looked at the corner of the room. The far corner, past the foot of the bed, between the window and the bathroom door. There was nothing visible there. The room was the same room I had checked at 11. Same shadows, same faint smell of antiseptic, and the floral lotion her daughter brought. Same hum of the monitoring equipment. Nothing had changed, but she was looking at that corner with an expression I will not forget. Not fear, something older than fear. The exhausted resignation of someone who has been tolerating something for a long time and has run out of the energy to tolerate it anymore. I asked her who it was. She said her husband's name. She said he had been evil when he was alive. She said he had made her life a living hell for 40 years. And she said he was standing there to take her. She said this the way you say, "There is a car parked in front of the house." The way you say something that is simply, factually true. I sat with her for the rest of that hour. I held her hand. I did not look at the corner again. I do not know why I made that choice. I think I was afraid of what might happen to my ability to do this job if I looked at that corner and saw something, or if I looked and saw nothing and still felt the room the way I was feeling it. I talked to her about small things, about her daughter, who she had told me on a previous shift was a teacher in another state, about the weather outside, which I described to her even though I could not see it from where we were. She seemed to calm. Her breathing became easier. Her grip on my hand became lighter. At 4:17 she died. Quietly, without distress, the monitors marking it with a long, soft tone that I reached over and silenced. I documented the time. I called the attending. I completed the required notifications, all of it exactly as I have done many times before. But when I left that room at the end of my shift that morning, I stopped in the doorway. I looked at the corner. The early gray light was coming in at the window by then, the thin winter light of 5 in the morning, and the room was plain and still and empty. And the air in that corner felt different. I do not know another way to describe it. Not cold, not disturbed, just absent. The way a room feels after furniture has been moved that had been there for a long time. A kind of negative space where something had been. I have thought about that night for years. I have thought about what she saw and what she felt and what it means about the hours before we die. About whether the people who made our lives difficult in life follow us to the threshold of whatever comes after. I have thought about whether the clarity she had that night, the lucidity I was not expecting from someone at her stage of decline, was the body clearing itself for something it understood was coming. She died not afraid of the end. She died asking for help. And I sat with her in the dark and held her hand and looked away from the corner. I do not know if that was the right thing, but it is what I did. I want to be honest with you about something before I start. For a long time after this happened, I blamed myself. I replayed every moment looking for the thing I should have done differently, the moment I should have been more forceful, the moment I should have been less polite, the moment I should have understood what was happening before it escalated. I want to say clearly, before I tell you any of this, there was no such moment. Nothing I did or did not do caused what happened. Understanding that took me a long time. I was 19. First year of university, living in the residence halls, in one of those buildings where every floor had keycard-only access. You could not get onto another floor without a card registered to that floor. The building was supposed to be safe because of that, and in some ways it was. In the ways that mattered, it was not. It was the last night of October. I had injured myself a few weeks earlier playing sport, so I was on restricted activity, which meant no Halloween parties, no going out. I made the best of it. I helped my floor mates with costumes and makeup for most of the evening. When the last of them had gone out, I packed up my things, walked back to my room, and said goodnight to the corridor. A guy I had met briefly in the common room earlier that week fell into step beside me in the hallway. We had exchanged a few sentences before, nothing significant, the kind of interaction you have dozens of in the first weeks of university, brief and forgettable. He asked how I was spending the night. I told him. He followed me to my door. When I said goodnight and put my key in the lock, he walked into my room behind me. Not aggressively, not with any overt force. He simply moved through the door with the casual confidence of someone who assumed he was invited. I told him I was going to sleep. He sat down. I told him again. He stayed. I asked him to leave. He made a comment about how it was still early. I asked him a second time more directly. He left, or I thought he did. I went to bed, told myself it was just a weird moment, one of those uncomfortable social blurrings that happen in shared living spaces. I told myself I was overreacting. 3 days later, the emails started. One a day, sometimes more. Not threatening at first, just present, just consistently, inescapably present. I did not respond. The emails continued. Then he started showing up. In the corridors, at the dining hall, walking behind me to class, always at a distance that could be explained as coincidence if I tried hard enough to explain it. Always close enough that I knew it was not coincidence at all. I tried ignoring him. I tried being busy. I tried the things that 19-year-old girls try when they are afraid of making a situation worse by reacting. He waited outside my building once, then twice, then most evenings. One Friday I got a text from a floor mate. "Do not come back tonight. He is outside your door. I stayed at a friend's apartment off campus. When I came back the following morning, my floor mates told me he had waited for 4 hours. 4 hours. In a dormitory corridor, outside a closed door, on a Friday night. 4 hours. I went to the resident advisor. She was kind and took notes and told me she would look into it. I went to the university's student services office. They sent me a form. The emails continued. He began following me in a way that was no longer deniable, not across campus, but from building to building, close enough that I could hear his footsteps behind mine. I would speed up. He would speed up. I would turn a corner. He would turn the corner. I developed a route to class that went through the busiest parts of campus at every hour. I stopped eating alone. I stopped walking alone after dark. I stopped feeling like a student. I felt like prey learning to move in a world that had become a hunting ground. The university eventually acted after 3 formal complaints, after I provided printed copies of 94 emails sent over a 6-week period, after 2 witnesses submitted statements about the corridor incident. They issued a no-contact order. They moved him to a different floor. The emails stopped, but here's the part that still sits with me years later. A few months after everything was resolved, I ran into a mutual acquaintance who knew him from before university. She told me casually, with no apparent understanding of the weight of what she was saying, that this had happened before. At his secondary school, with another girl, a complaint had been filed. He had been spoken to. He had arrived at university with that history behind him, and I had known none of it when I said goodnight in a corridor and watched him walk uninvited through my door. I was not the first. I do not know if I was the last. What I know is that the feeling of being watched, genuinely, deliberately watched, does not leave you when the watching stops. It becomes a layer you carry under your ordinary days, a constant low-frequency awareness that the world contains people like him, and that there is almost never a warning before the first moment you understand what you are dealing with. There are things I do now, every day, automatically, that I did not do before. Routes I walk, doors I check, the way I note in any room I enter where the exits are. I do them without thinking. They have become the architecture of how I move through the world, and I am never not aware of why. My mother's friend, I will call her Diane, is one of the most practical, unsuperstitious, level-headed people I have ever known. She is the person you call when your car breaks down at midnight or you need someone to sit with you in a hospital waiting room. Steady, clear-eyed, capable. Which is why when she told me this story, I sat very still and listened. Because if something was able to get past Diane's attention for that long, it was something that had been very careful and very patient. She had been living alone in her house in a quiet residential neighborhood in the Pacific Northwest for about 3 years when she first noticed the discrepancies. Small ones, the kind that are easy to explain away. A pot of soup that she was certain had enough left for 3 or 4 more meals, gone after a day she had been at work for 12 hours. She assumed she had eaten more than she remembered. A towel in the hamper that was damp. She was tired often. She worked long hours. She assumed she had simply forgotten using it. Extra dishes in the dishwasher. Not a lot, just 1 or 2 more than she remembered leaving. She told herself she was losing track. She told herself this was what happened when you lived alone and worked the kind of hours she worked. The days blurred, the routines compressed, and sometimes you simply did not remember every meal, every shower, every glass of water. It went on for months. The soup continued to deplete faster than she could account for. Eggs she was certain she had not used were missing from the carton. Her bar of soap was smaller than she expected it to be. Her shampoo was running low faster than it should. These are things that are almost impossible to report to anyone, she told me. They are things that make you sound confused. They make you sound like you are losing your grip on your own daily reality. So she said nothing, and it continued. There was an evening in late autumn when she heard something from the floor above. A dull thump, the kind of sound that a house makes when it settles, or a book falls off a shelf, or a branch drops on the roof. She told herself one of those things. She went to bed. A week later, the sound again. She stood at the foot of the stairs and listened, and this time there was something underneath the silence after the initial sound, a quality of stillness that was not the stillness of an empty house. She called her neighbor, who came and walked through the upstairs with her. They found nothing. She told herself it was the house. The thing that finally broke it open was not dramatic. She was looking for her spare set of keys one evening, the set she kept on a hook in the mudroom, and they were not there. She searched the house for an hour. They were not anywhere. She called a locksmith and had the locks rekeyed. The following week, the thumping from upstairs again. Louder this time. She picked up the phone and called the non-emergency police line. An officer came. They went up together. The attic was accessed through a pull-down hatch in the ceiling of the second-floor hallway. The officer went up first. He was up there for about 30 seconds. Then he came back down and he said, "Ma'am, I need you to go wait outside." What they found in the attic was a living space, a sleeping bag, a battery-powered camping lantern, a hot plate connected to an extension cord that had been run very carefully along the attic joists to a wall outlet in the second-floor bathroom, the bathroom that adjoined the bedroom where Diane slept every night. Canned food, a small handheld radio, clothes, a paperback book, and a spare key that matched the style of her previous locks. A man had been living in her attic, not for days, not for a week or two. Based on what the investigating officers determined from the evidence and from interviews with neighbors who eventually recalled seeing an unfamiliar figure coming and going from the rear of the property, he had been living there for somewhere between 4 and 6 months. He had learned her schedule. He had learned when she left for work and when she came home. He had come down while she was out, used the bathroom, eaten food from the kitchen in quantities small enough not to be immediately noticed, and gone back up. He had been doing this with such consistency and such patience that the only evidence he left was the gradual arithmetic of things used up and missing. An arithmetic she had been explaining away as her own forgetfulness. He had been careful. He had been very careful. And he had been sleeping 8 feet above her bed. He had been listening to her move around in the house below him every evening. He had been hearing her make phone calls, hearing her watch television, hearing her go to bed. He had known every detail of the rhythms of her life because he had been living inside them, in the space between the ceiling she looked up at and the roof above. The police found him trying to re-enter the attic through a rear window 2 nights later. He had not yet realized the locks had been rekeyed on the house proper. He still had a key. He had come back because for months the house had been home. Diane did not return to that house. She stayed with family for a week and then found a new rental. She never went back. Not even for the rest of her belongings. Her neighbor packed them. She told me this story about 2 years after it happened. She told it steadily and carefully, the way she does everything. When she finished, I asked her what the worst part was. She thought about it for a moment. She said the worst part was the realization that her instincts had been right all along, that she had felt something was wrong for months, that she had stood at the foot of those stairs and felt the quality of the silence above her and known on some level that it was the silence of something waiting, and that she had talked herself out of it. Every single time, she had talked herself out of trusting herself. And she said, "I will never do that again." She said it without anger, without drama, the way she says everything, just steadily, just as a fact she had decided to live by. I believed her, and I think about that sometimes, in the quiet moments of ordinary evenings, when the house settles and something shifts in the ceiling above me. I think about her, and I listen.